Let's look at a 15th century, original 15th century, Venetian Schiavona longsword. Hi folks, Matt Easton here at Schola Gladiatoria. So I'm here at the moment at Woolley & Wallace in Salisbury, looking at some items from their upcoming auction on the 27th, 28th of November 2024. And this is a really interesting piece. It is what we might call a Schiavonesca. Okay, so it is essentially an ancestor of what most people know as the Schiavona. Now the Schiavona, as most people think of it, is a later 16th, 17th century basket-hilted sword. In fact, they were still being made all the way through to the 18th century. But this is where they come from. Now, very briefly, to talk about the term Schiavona, essentially means Slavic. Okay, so it's essentially the Italian word explaining that this is a Slavic-inspired sword. And in fact, this style of sword with this kind of rectangular pommel with a little circle raised in the center there, as you see there, and various types of quillons you actually find on these, but these type of reversed curled quillons are quite characteristic. This style of hilt, usually on a cutting centric blade, and we'll come to the blade details in a second, is characteristic of the area that later on became essentially Yugoslavia. So we're talking about places like Croatia and Serbia. These types of swords did also reach up into Hungary, but they found their way into Italy via the Slavic mercenaries that the Venetians in particular, but also other Italians, brought in. So the state of Venice was far-reaching, and it had trade interests and even fortifications and ports all over the place. And it clearly had a lot of influence in the Adriatic, and it ended up with a lot of, you could loosely call them Slavic, probably mostly Croatian and Serbian mercenaries. And they had characteristic or styles of sword or preferences in swords, which meant that in Venice, we ended up with these characteristic styles of pommels and guard, and these evolve into, in time, the characteristic Schiavona hilt. So the reason that the Schiavona Italian sword is specifically from Venice goes all the way back to the fact that they had Slavic mercenaries in Venice. So, is it Venetian? Is it Slavic? It's a bit of both. It's a melding of cultures and traditions. So this particular sword probably is, I would say, late 15th century. They're a little bit difficult to date, and we need to see more studies on them. But the reason I date it thus is partly because of the guard. So in fact, we do find swords of this type with a broadsword blade, essentially a double-edged, fairly broad blade, with a later development, and goes from the 15th into the 16th century. So this is probably from the late 1400s, in my opinion. Your mileage might vary on that. The grip, I should mention in case anyone's wondering, is a replacement, but it's good because it helps me to hold the sword. So you'll notice that it is a long sword, but it's not a particularly long grip. And actually, when we look at original long swords from this period, that's very often the case. So in the modern world, we might like our recreated replica long swords to have nice long grips on them. But actually, the majority of long swords in period actually don't have particularly long grips in general. Anyway, so this is a sword which you could use on horseback in one hand, or if you're carrying a shield or something with the left hand, and it's fine. It weighs fine, it balances nicely. You could use it quite conveniently as a one-handed sword. It's quite long. So the blade is, we'll do some of the other stats in a minute, but the blade is around 37.5 inches long. So it is sort of typical long sword length. It'd be quite long for a one-handed sword. In two hands, it's quite a light, quite a nimble sort of sword. Now, as I've mentioned in previous videos, the curling of the quillons usually twists to the outside with the rear quillon and to the inside with the front quillon. This means that it protects the finger and thumb with the front quillon, and it protects the wrist with the rear quillon. So this shows that this sword was made for a right-handed person. If the guard twisted the other way, we'd assume that it was possibly made for a left-handed person. But usually these guards twist that way, inwards on the front, outwards on the back. If I was left-handed, it'd be the wrong way around. So the blade is interesting. So in Eastern Europe, they maintained a love of broad chopping, slashing blades more than in Western Europe at this time. So in Western Europe, there was a general move, it wasn't universal, but there was a general move towards more tapered, thicker, stiffer blades to deal with armour, essentially. So people in a mixture of mail and plate, brigandine, so on and so forth. More focus on the point. You will see that this is a broad cutting blade with a spatulate and broad tip. So this blade overall in shape is actually more similar to blades from earlier centuries, 12th, 13th century, and functionally it's not that different to swords from the Viking age. It is possible in some cases that some of these Schiavona do have older blades on them. Now, this particular blade has a fuller that's very, very shallow, and you might not even be able to see it. I think you can just see it with the light reflecting there. So the fuller comes down only for the first roughly 18 inches down the blade, and in the fuller is a very important thing that we'll show here, and hopefully you can see it if I catch the light right there. It is the running wolf of Passau. The so-called running wolf of Passau. The reason I say that is because the running wolf became such a sign of, I guess, quality throughout Europe, because German sword blades carrying that mark originally were well-made swords that people knew they could trust with good quality steel, but people did copy it. So there were people in other areas putting that wolf, and I have to say that looks like a fairly one, so it's essentially engraved, chiseled into the blade, and then the brass latten is hammered into it. It does potentially look like it's an original one. So it's very likely anyway that this is a German blade, and it's possible it's an older German blade mounted on a later hilt. It could be a 13th, 14th century blade mounted on a 15th century hilt. That did happen, or it could be a 15th century blade made for the people that liked these sorts of cutting blades. So all that remains to say is that here's some basic stats for this sword, because I know that you guys like that. So the blade in total, as I mentioned, it's 37.5 inches long, which is 95 centimeters. The blade is 95 centimeters. The total weight is 1,460 grams, which honestly is actually relatively light for its size. So this could be quite a nimble sword. However, what I would say is that the point of balance is quite far out. So when you balance the sword here, because of the broad blade and weight distribution, it is 15 centimeters from the guard, so it balances quite far from the hand. So this is a sword that wants to cut and is not particularly nimble, even if it's fairly light. In a funny sort of way, it reminds me of some 19th century cavalry sabres, I know. So it's overall quite light, but the point of balance is quite far out. In terms of the distal taper, it is 7 millimeters at the base, it is 3.8 millimeters at the middle, and 2.1 millimeters up here. So it has got bags of distal taper. It's not especially thick at the base, but it's not thin. 7 millimeters on the dot, 3.8 at the middle, 2.1 millimeters towards the tip. So it's a really flexy blade. So in some ways, it does share some characteristics with things like a 1796 light cavalry sabre. It has an overall light blade with a lot of distal taper ending up very broad but thin up here, but the point of balance is quite far from the hand. So it does lend itself to having the hands together. It's not a very long grip, and being a strong chopping sword. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed seeing it, and that is featured in the upcoming sale here at Woolley and Wallace. On the 27th and 28th of November, the catalogue's down below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.